Professor Rahul Mukherji, who is professor and head of the Department of Political Science at the South Asia Institute in Heidelberg University in Germany, is currently the executive director of the South Asia Institute. He's also a senior non-resident fellow of the Institute of South Asian Studies, National University of Singapore, where he worked before, and the co-chair of the China-India workshop at Fudan University in Shanghai. He co-edits a book series titled Institutions and Development in South Asia with the Oxford University Press. Rahul has co-authored India since 1980, published by Cambridge University Press in 2011, and authored Globalization and Deregulation, Ideas, Interest, and Institutional Change in India, also published by OUP in 2014. And also he has recently published a paper in the Journal of Democracy, focusing on governance of COVID. I think that gives a very good background. And on top of all that, he's a very close friend of mine for more than 2 decades now. So over to Rahul.
It's indeed a wonderful opportunity for me to reconnect. I should be able to share my slides, right? I should be able to share my slides. Share. Yes. And then I can everybody see the slides?
Yes, we can.
Good. So
I think, can you switch off presenter mode, because it's showing the next slide up as well. If you are able to, there is a way, you know, those not there, the 3 buttons on top, just under the slide, there are three dots.
Yes.
Just, yeah, that's right. Go there.
Hide presenter view. Hide presenter view.
Right, then you can see it nice and big. Is that okay?
Can you see?
Yeah. It's much better now.
Yeah,
you can
much
see
better.
it. You can.
Yeah.
You can.
But
see
you can now you put that full screen mode. Yeah.
Oh, should I put on the full screen mode? Is it?
No, it is.
Yeah. Okay. It's okay. Yeah.
It's okay. Wonderful. So this is indeed a wonderful opportunity for me to connect with Sri Lanka, and as Professor Silva has mentioned, he's not only a friend, and even though I'm not very knowledgeable about the politics and governance of Sri Lanka, I have a deep interest in that area. I'm also thankful to Professor Dias for cordially inviting me and for being so patient, because I have been a little erratic in my responses, but that certainly does not reflect the intensity of my feeling and my willingness to present some of my ideas briefly. Now, this presentation is going to be very Indo-centric, because that is what I know about, and I would not like to belabor on issues where I don't have so much competence. I am aware of the fact that there was a national lockdown in Bangladesh, as well as in Sri Lanka, as well as in Pakistan in March of 2020. I am also aware of the fact that, like in the case of India, the parliament was dissolved in Sri Lanka on the 2nd of March 2020. I'm also aware of the fact that the National Operations Center for Prevention of COVID-19 outbreak was headed by an army officer, Lieutenant General Shavindra Silva. And there is an argument about Sri Lanka that a lot of the presidential task forces might have been dominated by areas of the government that could speak to the military. And there's been critical literature on this, but I'm not going to belabor this point because I'm not an expert. In the case of Bangladesh, there is some literature that suggests that once again, the lockdown was quite chaotic, but civil society organizations rose in response to the situation. In the case of Pakistan, it has been suggested that Certainly, the pandemic did not hurt democracy because democracy itself was very fragile when the pandemic came. So the fact that the pandemic did not impact democracy is not saying too much. This is an opinion voiced by Professor Akbar Zaidi, who was for many years at Columbia and now has gone back to head a private university in Karachi. It is in this context and in this milieu, I feel that my comments about India might be useful for understanding the governance of the pandemic in South Asia within a comparative frame. So what I will do is that I will talk a little bit about why the infections rose and fell and then rose again in India. Then I will say a few things about why India's vaccine strategy was very, very below potential, because as you know, India has a very, very robust pharmaceutical sector, and it also engaged in what it called vaccine diplomacy. But the whole strategy was very suboptimal and it took many lives. And then finally, I will say a few things about the impact of the pandemic on India's democracy. I am one of those who believe that India's democracy is challenged. I certainly don't think that pandemic is the reason for that challenge, but I do believe that the pandemic may have accelerated some of the forces that came to a visible arena. I will not make a lot of comments about the economy, but I must let you know that India, before the pandemic, was one of the fastest growing economies in the world. It had also a rights-based approach, which was producing welfare at an unprecedented level. But after the pandemic, we know that India has probably gone back to levels of unemployment that were only known in the past. We are also aware of the fact that India is one of the most laggards in terms of growth rates, economic growth rates in the world today. So India is beginning to resemble not the emerging economy that it was before the pandemic, and much before the pandemic, when the certain dispensation which is in power today came to attain power. So, but I'm not going to say much about the economy because that is not my remit. I will now take you to this slide on the rise and fall of infections. As you can see, the rise and fall of infections, let's look at the first phase. The first phase begins, this is 2020, and we are looking at 2027, 6, 3, 4, right? So in March of 2020, a lockdown was imposed. As you can see that in the March of 2020, when the lockdown was imposed, it was not looking like a scary situation. And the government must be credited for having imposed the lockdown. But what was the problem? The problem was that the lockdown was not consulted technically in a manner in which it would have been successful. The first problem with the lockdown was that there was a complete curfew promulgation without the ability of the state to support people who are migrant laborers. There was a partial lockdown, and then on the 24th of March, immediately after the partial lockdown, there was a major lockdown, and thereafter, the parliament was suddenly shut. And before the parliament was shut, no serious deliberation happened in the parliament. There were lots of leaders in the opposition who were calling for it. The state of Kerala was performing wonderfully at that time to deal with the COVID cases which had first arrived in that state. But neither was Kerala consulted, nor were the opposition leaders consulted. The Indian Council of Medical Research scientists had actually published 2 papers in the Indian Journal of Medical Research, which had argued against a large-scale short lockdown of the kind of curfew type which was promulgated, because they had argued rightly that it would not be sustainable given India's population and its poverty. So what happened was that the lockdown happened, and you can see that the lockdown was not really successful because the cases really rose by September. And why did that happen? That happened because the lockdown was physically unable to keep migrant labor in the absence of minimal or no welfare commitment within the doors that they were supposed to be in. So they started running, cycling, walking, defying the law to get back to their places. And the entire situation created a very messy problem. It was also not something that the poor people appreciated. And the result of all that was that the National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme was then hiked up because it was felt that the situation is getting to be bad. So the right to work, which the government had earlier criticized, was invoked in a very big way. And the fiscal stimulus, which was at that point in time about 1 percentage point of GDP, was considered generally to be very low. I mean, all the economists agreed that the fiscal stimulus should have been at least 5 percentage points of GDP. In this milieu, a large number of public interest litigations were put before the Supreme Court Chief Justice, and not one of them was heard. But the response actually came from the fact that the government started realizing that the lockdown was failing, and therefore some more stimulus and some more effort was required. Now, this leads us to a situation where we find that once the figures started coming down by about 2021 January and February, when scientists of the Indian Council of Medical Research were saying that the story is not over yet, India became underconfident. It became underconfident to the extent that it felt that there would be enough vaccines and there would be no problem. So the Prime Minister went to Davos and said that India can become a world teacher in combating COVID. This overconfidence, and I will explain in the next slide, led to a situation where India had a very suboptimal strategy with respect to vaccines. And then once again, you have this major rise and fall. And this rise and fall is actually a catastrophic rise, because this is the rise and fall where the government was taken in so much by surprise that even the rich and the elite and the middle class could not access oxygen in the capital city of Delhi. And there was very, very little infrastructure to serve anybody. I mean, in fact, this became like a classless society because everybody got COVID, and there is almost every family, including mine, where 1 or 2 people have died. So the point is that this suboptimality produced this rise. And then, of course, again, another fall. And then I'm not coming to the Omicron situation, because the Omicron situation has not been as devastating as this second scenario. So let me then say a few things about the vaccine situation. India could have played the market and won. India was in a position to serve the world. This is because India has capacity to serve as a vaccine manufacturer to the world. But India failed to do so because the state could not deploy its strengths properly. It is only after the second wave from April till September 2021 that the government realized, but did not own up its mistakes. Now, why do I say this? The Vaccine Alliance, Gavi, was launched with $750 million from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. It depended on the Serum Institute of India in a big way. 65% of the world's children receive at least one vaccine from Serum. Anthony Fauci, the head of the United States National Institutes of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, noted they have the capability of making vaccines for 6 planets. Seth Berkley, CEO of Gavi and epidemiologist, gave Cyrus Poonawalla the Vaccine Hero Award. Gavi and the Coalition of Epidemic Preparedness Innovations urged the Oxford team to work with a big pharma company that could navigate regulatory bottlenecks. The strategy was to get AstraZeneca to prepare vaccines for high-income countries and the Serum Institute to manufacture for India and the developing world. Clinical trials showed that the adenovirus-based vaccine protects people, though not as effectively as the mRNA vaccine. SIE was to serve the neediest countries. The Gates Foundation provided 300 million to Gavi, which was directed to the Serum Institute manufactured Covishield project. The COVID-19 Vaccines Global Access Facility, COVAX, was also procuring vaccines for the poorest countries. It had also given the Serum Institute the clearance for manufacturing for poor countries. There are a number of reasons why the Serum Institute failed to deliver despite its reputation and support of CEPI and COVAX. The government decided not to support SII, but another company, Bharat Biotech. The Director General of the Indian Council of Medical Research issued a letter saying that Bharat Biotech would be ready by August 15, 2020. Its co-vaccine was rolled out without adequate tests. The Prime Minister himself got a shot. India, in my opinion, made 3 mistakes. First, the Prime Minister underestimated the possibility of the second wave and India's need, despite former Prime Minister Dr. Manmohan Singh's giving a terse warning to the contrary. The Health Minister, himself a medical doctor, had retorted rudely at that time. The government did not invest adequately in the domestic production of vaccines. In fact, Prime Minister Modi began proclaiming success in vaccine diplomacy without planning for the second wave, which had been predicted by the scientific community. The Health Minister began supporting an Ayurvedic drug called Coronil with no scientific justification. Coronil was inaugurated by the Health Minister despite the fact that the World Health Organization had not approved it. It was manufactured by an Ayurvedic self-styled yogi, Baba Ramdev, who was probably close to the establishment. Second, India could have embarked on a successful export drive with adequate preparation. This was not to be because the second killer corona wave suddenly found the country wanting for more vaccines. Third, rather than backing the firm most likely to produce the vaccine, India began to focus on the indigenous vaccine. Moreover, attempts could have been made to open up licensing of vaccines to other pharma companies as well. This route was not pursued. The result was that India could not only vaccinated itself, but also contributed more meaningfully to the global effort based on its competitive advantage. The governments engaging with vaccine diplomacy may well have succeeded, but not without proper understanding of science. The saga tells us why scientific knowledge is important for the state to solve its policy riddles. Now, so much is all that I'm going to talk about vaccines. How many minutes do I have, Tudor? Okay, I probably have about 5 minutes or...
Yes. Please go
5 minutes, 5 minutes. Okay.
Yeah.
So let me quickly summarize my view on the impact of the pandemic. I have argued in the paper in the Journal of Democracy that India is moving in the direction of what is called competitive authoritarianism, which does not mean that India has turned authoritarian. It just means that over time, the electoral process has elected leaders who make it more easy for incumbents to stay in power. But certainly, it's not like the story of democracy is over. As we know, in many Indian provinces, opposition parties have been winning elections. So what has happened in India is that state civil society relations have drifted towards Hindu nationalism. When I say drifted, it means that sometimes legal changes happen in a way that are not really legal. So they're really not legal changes. They are basically interpreting laws in a different way. At other times, real legal changes happen, which are very minor, and they promote a different idea of the constitution and the state. And finally, you can also have a situation when there is a major legal change. That we call displacement. I have argued in my writings that India is drifting, layering, and sometimes displacing its institutions in favor of and distant from the idea of secularism in a move towards an ethno-nationalist, Hindu nationalist state. Pandemic is certainly not a cause, but it is a facilitator. So how is it a facilitator? Well, what is drift, for example? We know that the Indian Parliament, for example, has not been deliberating much of late. And this is something that has been facilitated by the pandemic. This has led to hasty legislations without consultation. Some of the modes of function of the Supreme Court, especially in the past on the internet mode, has also facilitated slowing down of caseload, which would have helped promote, otherwise have helped promote democratic propensities. There are certain aspects of fiscal federalism that especially arose as a result of how the GST revenues were to be shared and how the COVID costs were to be borne, which did not undergo the kind of consultation that is well known in India's economic history. These are all sort of drifting mechanisms. Nothing legal has changed. However, there have been legal changes like the Foreign Contributions Regulation Act of 2020, which makes it much more difficult for foreign-funded non-governmental organizations to perform if the state does not like you. Then there have been the farm bills. The farm bills were passed very hastily, and I can talk more about this in the Q&A. But as anyone who's following India knows, that it met with such an opposition from the farmers that the Prime Minister actually repealed the farm bills. But once again, there is resistance. The farm bills have been repealed, but many of the points that the farmers made in their interests have not yet been addressed. Then a fund was set up called PM Cares, in addition to the Prime Minister's Relief Fund. And the manner in which this fund was launched hastily without consultation in the Parliament was certainly facilitated by post-COVID scenarios. And it is certainly a layered effort to move away from accountability. Things like the Unlawful Activity Prevention Amendment Bill, which makes it easier for you to arrest somebody, the Citizenship Amendment Act, which tries to make a distinction between Hindus and Muslims, are both pre-COVID phenomena. The electoral bonds, which have redounded to the advantage of the ruling party, is also a pre-COVID phenomenon. The abrogation of Article 370 in 2019, which is a very major change. It is almost a displacement of institutions because Jammu and Kashmir had a special status, and it was not only converted to a normal status, but the state was actually converted to 2 union territories, Jammu and Kashmir and Ladakh, which means that the geography comes more directly under the control of the central government. This does not mean that the story of India's democracy is dead, because the farmers' movement is historic. I think it is a historic movement in the last couple of decades anywhere in the world. Political parties in the opposition have been winning elections in Chhattisgarh, in Punjab, in Maharashtra, Delhi, and most recently in West Bengal. And now we are looking at elections in 3 states, Uttar Pradesh, Punjab, and in Uttarakhand, which are being fiercely contested. So I would summarize the last point by saying that the pandemic certainly did not produce the ethno-nationalist propensity, which has tried to curb some of the old democratic tradition inside of the state, but it certainly may have spurred some of those propensities. So with that, I think I will conclude and take a few questions, if there are any.
Thank you, Rahul. I don't see any questions either in Q&A or chat, but because this paper is so important, I think we need to, take up a few issues arising from this paper. Maybe.
Can I ask a question, Tudor?
Yes, please.
This is Priyan. Yes. So Yeah, so very interesting presentation, and also I suppose a challenging one in that sense. Now, I think you live and work in Europe, right? Where I think democratic institutions are sort of longer and perhaps stronger. Have you seen a similar move towards authoritarianism as a result of COVID-19, even in a small way, in sort of, you know, the older liberal democratic countries that you are probably close to in your everyday place of work? Yeah.
Sure. No, in fact, I think Germany has reasonably resisted, because, as you know, the authoritarian propensities have also arisen in Germany, in Europe, and it is a worldwide phenomenon. But my view is that these propensities have been somewhat resisted much more successfully in Germany, probably because of its historical. I mean, no other country has experienced such hardship that comes from a narrow parochial view of ethnocratic governance than has Germany. And so we find, for example, that in Germany, the Social Democratic Party has come as an important party in coalition with the Green Party. Of course, there are right-wing, non-democratic, ethno-nationalist forces, but in fact, this time, even the Christian Democratic Union is not in power. And the other thing is that I have taught at the Jawaharlal Nehru University in Delhi, which is under serious attack right now. I have also taught at the National University of Singapore, where promoting democratic values was not so important, although I would say that it was a liberal space. But in Germany, you could lose your job if you did anything that contravened with the idea of promoting democracy. So in fact, there are very few reasons why a professor in Germany can lose his job. And one of them happens to be undermining democratic values. So in that respect, I would say that Germany is not free of propensities, but given the propensities that have arisen all over the world, it is certainly one of the safer places. And certainly I feel freer here than probably I would feel in any other country in the world. I mean, I have experienced the United States. I have not taught in Britain, but I have lived in Asia and in India. That would be my response.
Thank you very much, Professor Rahul Mukherji. I'm sure other people also have questions, but I'm afraid we don't have...
Professor Madluma
yes.
has his hand raised. Why don't you let him ask? Professor Madluma. Professor Madluma,
can you unmute and ask the question? Professor Madhum Bandar?
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. I think we must congratulate for your very forthright statements with regard to centralized administration and its kind of pressure that it brings on democratic institutions and individuals. Have you any idea about the origins of the COVID? And there are two apparently streams of thought. One is it is natural, and the other one is man-made. In case it is man-made, what kind of political impacts it would have internationally?
Thank you, Professor Madhuma. I have heard, I mean, I have done a little bit of freelance research on this subject, but I can't claim to be an authority on the subject. It seems to me that, you know, I really cannot make, I cannot come down on one view. I mean, there is certainly evidence that this virus was being researched in a laboratory very close to the place where there was this market. From what I understand is that the same bat was being researched in Wuhan. It is abundantly clear to me that the Chinese state was aware of the presence of this virus before it became public. But I am not so confident whether the Chinese did it purposely. I mean, I can't come to that extreme conversation. I mean, I'm a little unhappy, but this is not unusual in the Chinese situation, that they have not encouraged a lot of research onto the origins of the virus. But the point I'm trying to make in this presentation is that the virus is not at the root of this problem. The virus certainly can facilitate certain propensities in all the countries of South Asia. But at the root of the problem is an understanding that democracy and pluralism is something to be respected. It's like in any family, you know, an husband can easily walk out of the wife's life because the wife is being very impatient, or the wife can walk out of a husband's life. It takes a lot of patience for a family to evolve in a democratic way where the man and the woman are both respected along with the children. Now, obviously, the situation becomes much more difficult when you have a majority community and a minority community. And what is important, I think, and what is the Indian tradition, both in terms of the certain kinds of practices in Christianity, in Islam, and in Hinduism, is the cosmopolitan idea. That you are not saying, like the French, that we don't believe in religion, we are separate from religion. You are saying that we respect every religion. And India is not the kind of a nation state as is, let's say, France or Germany. It's far more diverse. So in that milieu, I think on the one hand, India could be a beacon light to show the world that diversity can live. Now, if that country with over 1 billion people, neighboring China, decides to move in another direction, then certainly I can't put all the blame on the virus. I have to put the blame on processes that are deeper. And from that perspective, I am not so worried about, I am worried about the virus, and clearly the management of the virus shows that a more democratic approach, a more consultative approach where the health ministry, the Indian Council of Medical Research and others, had they been consulted, had there been better amenities for welfare for migrant labor, things would have been much better. I would worry more about these things than thinking more deeply about what is the extent to which China went to despoil the world. This would be my approach, because that is not something I can control. But what I can make an impact on is what I believe is good for the world, which is the ability of human beings to live with each other and respect each other for their diversity and their difference.